second years, apologies. Hello second years, this is your mark scheme for your formal assessment 2. So exactly like it says on the board, what I'd like you to do before you go any further, pause the video and make a prediction of how you think that you have done. So roughly what grade or what mark you think you might get. Don't worry if it's not accurate. All I'm interested to know is if you've given yourself a really low one and actually do really well, why have you done that? Or if you perhaps thought you were going to do better than you did, why has that happened as well? So it's a method to help you reflect. I don't mind whether you've done well or not, okay? So, well, obviously I do. I want you to do well, of course, but I don't mind if you get the estimate wrong. It's an interesting method for you to think about it, and I want you to predict what might be your thing that you do well. So what's the thing where you go, oh yeah, I get ticks, 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 I've done all of that, that's really good. And then what are you predicting you might write at the end where you say, I need to remember to do this? And if you've predicted that at the beginning and you've done it at the end, you need to think carefully about how you're going to move forward, some practical steps to do that. So we have, we have all the past questions on Moodle, and I'm regularly accepting now students complete questions and send them to me, and I try and either speak to them in class or break or in the revision session, or email you your feedback as well. So there's that option, along with many, many other things. So it's absolutely vital that we're now starting to move to 2020, that you need to, that your exams will be creeping up soon, and you need to be putting concrete steps in place, okay? Because you can all do really well. You just need to put that practice in. Question 1, explain the process of synaptic transmission for 4 marks. Hopefully you've all aced this. We went over this quite a few times in the first year. If we didn't know, have a think about how you can move that forward. So you would get 1 mark for saying that the electrical impulse reaches the synaptic terminal, if you've mentioned that. There are more than 4 bullet points, but as long as you've mentioned most of the bullet points, 4 of the many bullet points, then you get the marks, okay? But there is a caveat, a little bit extra bit at the bottom that gives you an idea. So watch all the way through before you decide your mark. However, you can tick yourself off. So if you mention the action potential or the electrical impulse reaches the presynaptic terminal, then that is 1 mark. Then if you mention the electrical impulse triggers the release of neurotransmitters, then you get a mark. Neurotransmitters cross the synapse from the vesicles. Neurotransmitters bind or combine with the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And then if you've mentioned about the process of excitation or inhibition, then you can talk about that as well, but you certainly don't have to for 4 marks. 6 marks absolutely, but 4 marks no for excitation and inhibition. Okay, so then the postsynaptic neuron either fires or the message stops being fired across, and then additional marks that I would give you is if you talk about the neurotransmitters being released back into the synaptic gap and being reabsorbed in a process called reuptake through the transporters. So that's not on the board because or the screen, because I've taken the mark scheme directly from the mark scheme itself. I've copied and pasted. However, you would still get marks for that. Something that it's useful to be aware of, although you might want to wait to the second screen before you go any further with this, is that you can get marks for for a labelled diagram that explains the process. So if you're struggling, I see quite a few people, and this doesn't suggest you're struggling, but I see quite a few people quickly sketch it in the column, in the side, in the margin. Well, don't do that. Put it on the lined paper and then talk it through underneath, and that will get you the marks. But just make sure you're really clear the direction of transmission, which is the pre and which is the post, and which way the neurotransmitters are going. To get 4 marks, you must describe the beginning, the middle, and the end. So you must talk about the action potential running down the axon of the presynaptic neuron or something similar. You must talk about the synapses going across, the neurotransmitters going across the vesicles, and you must talk about them being released back into the synapse and then reabsorbed in a process called reuptake through the transporters. You must have that whole process. If you don't, it doesn't matter the amount of detail, but if you don't have that, then you do not get the 4 marks. So it must be, have I got beginning, middle and end? And if you want to mark them out, so you could draw a little box and write beginning around it, little box middle, little box end, okay, to make it clear where it is to get the 4 marks. The examiner's report said that this was a good question for discrimination because there were some very complex and detailed responses that went well beyond the requirements of the specification. Your responses, because of what I've taught you, so you potentially know more from biology or just from your personal study, they could be incredibly detailed. I've taken a very careful balance, and you are able to explain in a good amount of detail, but it doesn't go beyond the requirements of the specification. It meets them perfectly. So you should be able to access 4 marks with the information that I have given you, or 6 if it asked about inhibition or excitation. And it says, although these were not always well focused, so sometimes too much detail is a bad thing. That's why I don't teach you huge amounts of detail. So that's why you have enough just to get the 4 marks or the 6 marks, okay? Because I don't want to set you up for failure with something too complex. So weaker students mainly struggled with poor focus of the process, or more importantly, lack of specific terminology or inaccuracies. So just make sure you haven't made any of these common misunderstandings or mistakes. It's not the vesicles that cross the synaptic gap, it is the neurotransmitters. So make sure you're clear that it's the neurotransmitters that have crossed the gap. The action potentials are not excitatory or inhibitory. It's the neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are not fired across the gap, and they do not go into the postsynaptic neuron, as you know. They stop, they bond with the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, but then they are released back into the synapse. So the neurotransmitters go no further than the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Confusion between chemical and electrical transmissions. The electrical runs along is the action potential, the electrical impulse, which is inside the neurons, inside the presynaptic and the postsynaptic. The chemical is the neurotransmitter, and that's in the synapse, because as you well know, electricity cannot jump through thin air. I'm sure there's times when that's the case, but for this we're thinking about if you touch an electric fence, then you will get an electric shock. If you put your hand really close to but not touching the electric fence, you will not get an electric shock. So you need something else to help with that. Okay, so the electrical transmissions are inside the neurons. The chemical is inside the synapse. It's the neurotransmitter. Few people made use of diagrams, which suggests that it might be a good thing for you to do, although those that did generally were ineffective in explaining the process. A diagram is not enough. Explaining the process helps. So if you think, oh, I'm not going to be very good at explaining it, I'd like to have a diagram, have the diagram and the explanation, and you'd be amazed how many those together, how many marks you could access. Okay, so user knowledge of the functions of Broca's area and the motor cortex describe the problems that Lotta's grandmother is likely to experience. So this is about localization. Apologies, just trying to, just had a little bit of a coughing fit there. So let's have a look. So you get 1 mark for, as a consequence of damage to Broca's area, Lotta's grandmother is likely to suffer from speech or language problems. So if you've mentioned speech problems in Broca's area, you get yourself 1 mark. Then if you've mentioned language production, then you get a 2nd mark. So if you know that Broca's area affects language in some way, or speech, then you get a mark. If you can tell me specifically how, language production, then you get a 2nd mark. So just check, have you talked about language and about language production? You don't need to have made it clear that it won't affect her understanding, but you must not talk about speech comprehension, because as you know, that's Wernicke's area. So Lotta's grandmother would not have any problem comprehending speech, only producing her own speech. And then you could go into a little bit more detail. So an additional thing you might mention, but it's not key, Lotta's grandmother will only be able to talk in short, meaningful sentences which take great effort, or may only be able to say single words, because if we think about Tan could only say tan. There you go. And speech lacks fluency, difficulty with certain words which help sentence functions, such as it and the. Now, we haven't been into Broca's aphasia in that much detail. You can make a note of those. All you need to mention is language problems, speech production, but it's just useful for you to be aware of that other information as well. Then you need to talk about the motor cortex. So as a consequence of damage to the motor cortex, Lotta's grandmother is likely to suffer from loss of muscle function or paralysis. So Lotta's grandmother would not be able to move certain parts of her body. That would get you 1 mark. The final mark is essential. So now we're touching not only on localization but lateralization. Motor impairments would be on the right side of the body. She would struggle to move the right side of her body, and if you have not mentioned that, you are capped at 3 marks. If you mention the right side of the body, that's when you get your 4, if you've mentioned the other marks as well. We know that it would be the right side of the body because, of course, Broca's area is a language centre, L for language, L for left, and of course it will be the same hemisphere that's damaged for the motor cortex. Lateralization, left side of the brain, controls the right side of the body. Okay, so that's where you get your 4th mark from. A maximum of 2 marks for answers which only address one area of the brain. So if you've only talked about Broca's area or only talked about the motor cortex, or, and I'd like everybody to highlight, underline, scribble where you have mentioned Lotta or Lotta's grandmother. Okay, so make sure you've included that. Otherwise, in this case, we're being generous, you get a maximum of 2 marks for knowledge. You must, for full marks, have applied as well. So references to difficulties understanding speech, making up words or talking nonsense should not be credited, as this is Wernicke's area. So anything to do with understanding words or words making sense, making things make sense, is Wernicke's area, but producing that speech is Broca's area. So it was well answered with a sound knowledge of anatomy, so that I can remember marking this, and that's absolutely accurate. It was one of the better answered questions overall. Although and most students achieved level 2, which is between 3 and 4 marks. Where you lost marks was failing to mention that the left hemisphere cause problems in the right side for movement. So hopefully you've done that. If you haven't, just remember it for next time. Okay, so just check the function of the, it says some confuse the function of the motor cortex. Motor cortex, M for motor, M for movement. Motor, car, cars move, movement. I'm not quite sure what else to go with that. I'm pretty sure you'll be okay with it. Or just check you've actually mentioned the motor cortex. Have you talked about both areas of the brain? Okay. This one, I will show you the official mark scheme. I will show you the examiner's report, and then I will show you my mark scheme. Okay, so do not panic if this first mark scheme you struggle to access all the marks. I just wanted to show you what you could have talked about, and then extend that, and then you can, and then see what else you could mention that's specifically related to the way I've taught it. Mark schemes at the bottom always say credit any relevant material, and the material that I've taught you that's from the book is relevant. It's just the mark scheme slightly different, and I thought it might be of interest for you to see the mark scheme. So remember, using your knowledge, explain why Lotta might be wrong. Application, so think about that. As well as, so this is one of those standards AO1, AO2 questions, so make sure you've talked about it and then applied it, or make sure you've applied it. Lotta's grandmother might still be capable of functional reorganisation or plasticity. So functional reorganisation is just a fancy word for plasticity, or functional recovery. So you could talk about functional recovery there. So Lotta is wrong, so that would, just saying Lotta's wrong wouldn't get you any marks, but saying Lotta's grandmother could still recover would get you a mark. Or functional compensation by other undamaged areas. So have a think about what that overlaps with, what's that's similar to. It's similar to, you've got the homogeneous, the word I can't say, homogeneous, areas of the brain that take over from it. For example, the left hemisphere is damaged, Broca's area is damaged, or maybe the right hemisphere in the same location would also could pick up that function, and Lotta's grandmother would be able to produce speech fairly fluently again. Another thing that we've touched on briefly is the idea that plasticity slows with age. However, it doesn't so the older you get, the less plastic your brain is, but it never stops. So whilst age is against her, she still might be able to form new connections between neurons. So have a think which one that might connect with, which term we've talked about. So if it's about axons, then you could talk about axonal sprouting, or possibly neuronal unmasking. Either of those would work. Neuronal loss may be compensated for by regeneration, so axonal sprouting. The fact that some of the neurons have died, have been lost, have been damaged, could be managed by the fact that more axons will grow and recreate that network, like a traditional way that people recover, that heal. So you've got that cut, the skin heals over. This is the same. You've damaged some neurons. The axons from other neurons all sprout and grow together. Don't worry about that one at all, because we've not touched on it. It's not part of the spec. Although you're welcome, if you've got full marks and you want to go away and Google that term and have a little bit of a look at those concepts, then you can do. Something we've not touched on, but it's welcome for you're welcome to store in the back of your mind, again, not mentioned directly on the spec, but definitely still useful, is the idea that plasticity can help with other things. So it talks about the indirect effects. So it can help with such as swelling of the brain, or generally feeling unwell. So plasticity can help us manage those other experiences of ill health, or inadequate blood supply, so other parts of the brain dying, and the function not working. So plasticity works in lots of ways, but we've focused on one specific way. And you could touch on physiotherapy or rehabilitation that we've talked about. I know we had it in AO3, but you could touch on the idea that stimulating the brain can also lead to functional recovery as well. And you could touch on relevant studies, but because it's 4 marks and because it's AO1, I wouldn't recommend that, but if you've done that, you can still access the marks. Okay. Our mark scheme, the kind of things you would talk about. So we've already talked about similar areas of the brain taking over. So Broca's area in the left is damaged, so could the right side of that take over? Neuronal unmasking, so there may be, when there's damage to Lotta's grandmother's Broca's area or motor cortex, there's far too much information being sent to that damaged part of the brain. So the brain might open up some dormant synapses which would cope with that additional brain activity that's suddenly knocking about, because the damaged part of the brain can't manage it. So they open up some synapses which would then pass on that brain activity, the motor activity, for example, or the Broca's area, the speech fluency as well. So a bit like opening a new lane on the motorway, or axonal sprouting, so where they grow new branches. So the Broca's area or the motor cortex is damaged, so new axons and new dendrites and different things all grow to recreate, to fill in the gap almost. You wouldn't need to mention all 3. I think mentioning 1 or 2 and explaining 1 or 2 is more than enough. But can you all look at your answer? Can you all underline where you've mentioned Lotta's grandmother, made reference to Lotta's grandmother, or one of the concepts, so age, the fact she's a woman, anything like that, but make sure it is relevant, you have applied it. So can you underline it to show you've applied it? Okay. Yeah, well, we know that. We know what the questions required of us. You're all very good at answering that. So it's the idea that Lotta's grandmother may still be able to make some recovery in spite of her age. So plasticity doesn't end at a certain age. It just gradually becomes less. The ability for the brain to grow and develop and change reduces as time goes on. Quite a few good knowledge of the concepts, but some people struggled to go beyond level 1, so the maximum would you get is 2 marks. If you haven't applied, this is why we practice application. It's so important. So make sure you've applied. If you have, you're getting into your level 2. Okay. So many simply described what plasticity and functional recovery were, with application limited to the inclusions of the term Lotta's grandmother, rather than discussing age. the fact she was a woman, age, education, because we've talked about education, anything that you can think of, okay, that might challenge Lotta's beliefs about her grandmother. So just check that your application goes beyond just saying Lotta's grandmother in some way, okay. And then students went above and beyond what was required. So far too much detail. So if you talked about all three in lots and lots of detail, if you started to run off, well, you can't run off the lines, I suppose, because it's in the book, but if you've given a massive chunk of more than, say, 4 sentences, then you're wasting some time, okay? And it talks about research evidence regarding age, gender, or education. So you do know about education and how it impacts plasticity. And we've touched on age. You know about age and the fact that it does continue as well. Explain one disadvantage of obtaining qualitative data in this study. So disadvantage, so you want to be looking at the P structure. In this study, you want to be applying. So you get 1 mark for an accurate or relevant disadvantage of quantitative data. This is a weakness of quantitative data is, and then some suggestions are a lack of detail, can't access people's opinions or the reasons why something is the way it is, or might not have a suitable option. So there's only yes or no. It's a closed question to collect quantitative data. So yes or no. What if it's maybe or sometimes? They might struggle. So 1 mark for a disadvantage that works, okay? I'll credit any valid answer, but so it doesn't have to be on there, but just make sure it's actually a correct evaluation point of a disadvantage. And then 1 mark for clear application. So you must make it relevant, and there it said, such as rating a patient's improvement. So it's about people who've experienced strokes. Make sure you're making reference to that. So can't assess why the person has improved, or specifically which function has improved, might be my suggestion. So it can't a weakness of quantitative data is that you cannot access the reasons why something is. You can assess whether something has or hasn't happened, but you might not be able to delve into why someone thinks that has happened or their opinion. This is a weakness because in this case specifically, you might not be able to assess why the person has improved or which functions have improved. Okay. Most students were able to give an advantage, but some failed to provide appropriate application. Please make sure you have applied. I hope you understand now why I bang on about it so much. Every single question we've done so far, apart from synaptic transmission, is about application. So some common incorrect answers were disadvantages of qualitative. So make sure you're talking about quantitative numbers, not qualitative. Numbers are easy. Quantitative is easy to understand and interpret. So that's a disadvantage of qualitative. Advantages of quantitative, so don't talk about a strength of it being easy to analyse. We want disadvantages, or advantages or disadvantages of questionnaires. So make sure it is specifically related to quantitative or qualitative, quantitative only data, okay, not questionnaires. Write one question that could be used in the researcher's questionnaire to produce qualitative data, and one that could be used to produce quantitative, or vice versa. So 1 mark for an appropriate question for quantitative. Make sure, read it, double check it. Does it make data that is quantitative? Does it make numerical data? So on average, how many hours of physiotherapy does the patient receive a week? Make sure that it is quantitative. Make sure it creates a number. Plus 1 mark for qualitative data. How does physiotherapy help your patients? What do you think about? What improvements have you seen? Why have you seen those improvements? So make sure it is open. Read it carefully. If you could give a yes/no answer, it's quantitative. You don't get a mark. Okay, so make sure that your qualitative one is yes/no. We can also accept relevant items that are not phrased as questions, i.e. describe or rate. So if it said describe your experiences of physiotherapy, that would be absolutely fine. Or for quantitative, if it said rate on a scale of 1 to 10, that would be fine too. Okay. Nearly all students managed to gain at least 1 mark. The quantitative question suggested were effective, but the qualitative ones could have produced a quantitative response. So be careful. Qualitative question, read it carefully. Could it produce a quantitative response? Could it be yes, no? Could you put boxes that people could tick? If you could, it is quantitative, not qualitative. As some students got quantitative and qualitative the wrong way round, so just make sure that you don't do that. Yeah, and there, as it says, although giving a closed answer response is not officially quantitative, so if you put yes or no, if you followed it, it was credited. So we got away with it, so that's fine. But just make sure you can distinguish between quantitative and closed questions in future. So really what we're looking for there, quantitative is being provided with a number. Okay. Right. Julia and her baby. The most important phrases here, or most important phrase, exogenous Zeitgebers. So the whole time you read your 8 marker, I want you to be thinking, am I talking about exogenous Zeitgebers? The focus is exogenous Zeitgebers. The only time you would use endogenous pacemakers is in AO3 as a challenge to exogenous Zeitgebers. 3 marks for AO1, 2 marks for AO2, 3 marks for AO3. Could you mark where your AO1 is, just like you do with Andy? Could you mark where your AO2 is, just like you do with Andy? So that one in particular I'm interested in. And could you mark your AO3? The thing that should reassure you about this is you could get away, I would say it's 3 marks for AO3, so 1 extremely detailed evaluation point would be more than enough. Okay? I understand that it's difficult to know how AO1, 2 and 3 are allocated. AQA don't give us any guidance. They specifically explain the reason that they do that is so that students read the question carefully. So as I've said before, really detailed stimulus, more AO2, limited stimulus like this one, discuss what Julie could do to encourage her baby to sleep more at night, is probably only 2 marks. Okay, so for description, the kind of things you could talk about: a definition, environmental cues which help regulate or entrain. If you use the word entrain, you can feel very proud of yourself. The sleep-wake cycle. There you go, and supports the entrainment of endogenous pacemakers. If it's a brief reference like that, it's fine, but if you start to talk about the SCN or melatonin, all of those things, they are endogenous pacemakers and they do not belong, definitely don't belong in AO1 and really have to be carefully used in AO3. You could also touch on light, and you could make reference to the idea that light comes into the eye, which then affects which is then registered by the SCN. The focus should not be the SCN. The focus should be the impact of light. And then meal times, so social cues such as meal times, people's behaviour and social activities. So if you've mentioned when people are most busy, so obviously in the day people will be more active, and at night people would be quieter and doing calmer activities. No marks if you have mentioned anything about pacemakers other than to support your comments on exogenous Zeitgebers. Okay. AO2 application. These are the suggested ones by AQA. If you've got something that you think is similar to this, but wait until the examiner's report, because they will give you some guidance. But Julia should try and keep her baby in the dark at night, shutting the curtains and keeping lights off, but expose her baby to light in the daytime, keep curtains open and go outside. Julia should also use social cues, lots of verbal communication, eye contact and feeding, only in the daytime, and then much quieter and calmer and as little as interaction as possible at night. So that the top one's light, the bottom one is social cues. Okay. And then evaluation. So the kind of things you would talk about, but must keep them relevant to exogenous Zeitgebers, Dacorsi with the chipmunks and the lesioning of the brain, which is says it's supporting evidence there, but of course it would be opposing evidence for exogenous Zeitgebers, apologies, and Ralph with the hamsters and the transplants as well. Let me just check. I might have put the wrong evaluation. Apologies, I did have the wrong evaluation. However, you can still use what I just talked about, just in a different way. So if you see there, it's opposing evidence of exogenous Zeitgebers is Dacorsi with the chipmunk or Ralph with the hamsters. And then you've got Campbell and Murphy. The shining the light in the back of the knee then changed the circadian rhythm of people. So clearly exogenous sight gabers are vital for managing the sleep-wake cycle. Practical applications, you've got controlling jet lag with Burgess et al. You've got lots of problems with animal studies. It's very difficult to extrapolate, or really contrasting alternative would be the interactionalist approach. Really, it's not just exogenous sight gabers or endogenous pacemakers, it's both together. Okay, so can I just ask one final thing that you check is, apologies, so ignore that. Although you might want to look carefully, ignore the S and the P, however the E is exactly the same. So you could talk about sloths in the 16, they sleep for 16 hours, unihemispheric sleep, REM and non-REM, and the amount that platypi have 60% REM and non-REM, whereas humans reach about 20 to 25%, and humans have sleep disorders, animals don't. If you said you cannot extrapolate from animals, and a lot of the research is based on animals, you must give me specific reasons why. If you just say, oh, they're animals and they're different, that's not good enough at second year. You must give reasons why. Can you check, are there 2 evaluation points? If there's 2 simple ones, or there's one very, very detailed one, then I'll accept that. So it doesn't matter if there's 1 or 2, I'm happy with that. But what I'm determined to see is, do you use the phrase a strength or weakness is, and in this case it would be for exogenous sight gabers, so make sure you're talking about that. Do you use an example? Do you use this is an example of because, or this suggests, or any sentence where you explain the example? So if you don't use the sentence structure at the start I've recommended, I don't mind. Have you explained the example and why it is supporting evidence, opposing evidence, practical application, whatever it is. And then this is a strength because, have you used that sentence? If you have, give yourself a tick for all of those. If you've done all of these things, you only need 1 evaluation point. Have you linked it back to exogenous sight gabers? Have you used the term validity? Might not always be needed, but almost always, as I say, 99.9% of the time. Have you included a however sentence? This is optional, but really it could be quite useful if you've done well. And then, as I've said, once you've marked all of your evaluation structure, can you read the whole answer again and tell me 1 thing you've done well? At least everybody has done 1 thing well, even if it's just written something. You must write something good because you are all good students, and 1 thing that you should include, some piece of information you might have missed, or something like that. Okay. There were some good answers, but generally it wasn't always answered well. They tended to be less knowledgeable, with answers only focused on application. You must show your knowledge as well as application. Remember, there are 3 marks for AO1 and 2 marks for AO2. Excellent knowledge of studies, but inappropriately selected. Read the studies you have written about. Are they about exogenous sight gabers? Yes, you get the marks. No, you don't. Make sure they're about exogenous sight gabers, not endogenous pacemakers. Some students gave a lot of detail of endogenous pacemakers and made this relevant through entrainment, although some students mistakenly suggested trying to replicate daytime conditions at night with night lights. If you mention night lights, they're no good. You shouldn't have bright lights at night because, as you know, that will wake you up. Struggling with temperature. So keeping them warm and cosy, helping and with social cues. Social cues I think you'd be okay with. I would avoid temperature altogether. Don't even bother with it. Okay. If you've done it and you think you've done it well, credit yourself. But if you haven't done it, don't remember not to. And discussion was the weakest element overall, with lots of wasted time on generic evaluations which were not linked back to exogenous sight gabers. So make sure you link it back to exogenous sight gabers. When it was done well, students tended to provide counter arguments of the role of endogenous pacemakers and compared contrasting research findings. So you can talk about endogenous pacemakers there and suggest about de Courcy and the fact that exogenous sight gabers were the same for the hamsters, but the brain was legioned, and therefore suggesting that the SCN is really, really important, which calling into question the validity of exogenous sight gabers. And also you could have discussed issues with generalising from adults to baby and or animals to humans. The best responses were those able to provide a sophisticated blend of application and discussion entwined throughout. I won't worry about that unless you can do it. So that's a fancy way of saying, can can you put AO2 in with AO3? If you can, fantastic. If you can't, it doesn't matter. I think the students who did that blend of application, it wasn't the fact they blended the application and the discussion together which got them the marks. It's because they had really understood the stimulus and the content, that it just fell together naturally. But that doesn't mean that if you haven't blended AO2 and AO3 that you can't access the marks. If you just have AO3 that's not applied, as long as it's relevant to exogenous site gapers, then that is absolutely fine. Okay, and that is that. Thank you very much.